Welcome everyone. We are back again with Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens for his class Midrash on the Parashah. As usual, I'll be inviting people to be panelists. That doesn't mean you have to talk. It just means we'll be able to see your face, which we'd love to. If you can turn on your camera, we'd love that. Put any questions in the chat or raise your hand. Anything else? I think that's about it. Yeah, please stay muted when you're not speaking and enjoy. Happy learning.
Thank you. So in this week's Parashah, Parashat Hashavuah, there's a midrash right at the beginning on the very first verse that I think provides, you're sufficiently imaginative perhaps, provides an interesting key for a new interpretation of perhaps the most famous scene in our Parashah, the most famous scene being, there's quite a few scenes to compete here, but the most famous scene being when Jacob dresses up as his brother Esau to receive the blessing fraudulently from his father Isaac. But I said that the midrash I'm going to look at the beginning is a midrash on the very first. Please paste the source material link or file in the chat. I have done that, but maybe we can do it again. Anyway. As I said, the first midrash we're going to look at, despite serving as this role or as this key for unlocking the deception scene, the heart of our parsha, the midrash itself appears on the very first pasuk of our parsha. The pasuk says, "Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holidet Yitzchak." These are the generations of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and of course. There's a superfluity in this verse. If he is Isaac, son of Abraham, you don't need to tell us that Abraham begat Isaac. That's superfluous. So it's into that superfluity that the midrashic imagination first, of the imaginative apple. So with that in mind, let's look at the midrash. It's there in the handout. This is Midrash Tanchuma, right at the beginning. Parashat Hashavuah. It says, "Va'amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Gadol hu hashalom shedibra haTorah divrei vadai b'shvil shalom." Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai said, "Peace is a really important virtue. It's so great that the Torah speaks words of fiction in order to promote peace, meaning words that aren't true. Although in modern Hebrew, badai is badaut is fiction. Ve'ezeh. Well, what are you talking about? What fiction does the Torah speak in order to make peace? Ko tamru li Yosef, ana sana pesha achecha v'chatatam. This is the brothers of Joseph, who right towards the very end of the book of Genesis, approach Joseph and say to him, "Our father said on his deathbed that we should tell you to forgive us of our sin. But we don't find in the actual verses that Jacob did tell Joseph's brothers to deliver this message. Ella, lafisha haya yodea chasiduto shel Yosef. Since Jacob knew the piety of Joseph, lo haya choshdo, u'machazik oto k'shofchei damim. Jacob didn't suspect Joseph of harboring malintent or fratricidal intent, homicidal intent towards his brothers. So Jacob never told his brothers, "Oh, you must go and tell Joseph, I beseech, on your behalf that he shouldn't be angry with you." And they just made it up. The brothers of Joseph were lying. But the Torah, I suppose, doesn't present it as a lie. It just tells us. The idea is, like I said, Jacob didn't think that Joseph would seek revenge, even for the hideous wrong that his brothers did him in his youth, right? That was water under the bridge. Joseph had forgiven them, but the brothers, they were scared. And it's according to this midrash, they fabricated this message from their father. And even despite the fact it was a lie, or at least a fiction, the Torah shares it with us without even making clear that it was a fiction. Why? Suggests Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because making peace between brothers it's just more important, perhaps even than truth. Okay, and then the midrash brings us to what's happening there on my screen? I'm not sure. Then the midrash brings us to a second example. Okay, so it says, "Bo ura'eh, come and see, koach hashalom, the power of peace. Shebesha'a shenitalta la Sarah miyad Paro liyad Avimelech, v'nitabra b'Yitzchak." At the time that Sarah left her imprisonment, basically in the hands of Pharaoh, and she left her imprisonment in the hands of Avimelech, she became pregnant with Yitzchak. Ayu umot ha'ulam omrim. So she became pregnant after these 2 periods of seclusion with other younger, perhaps more virile men. The people of the world started saying, "Halaven me'ash shana yivaled." Could it be that the father of this baby is a 100-year-old man? Elohim uberet ma'avimelech or mi Paro. Surely she got pregnant either from Avimelech or from Paro. V'haita chashad b'libo shel Avraham al elu advarim. And even Abraham was suspicious about these matters. Me asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What did God do? Amar la malach hamumuneh al yitzirat havalad. He went to the angel appointed with the formation of a fetus. Aseh kol ikonin shelo kidmut aviv. Make all of his, all of the strands of this embryonic tissue resemble his father, said God to the angel. Kedei sheya'idu hakol shehu b'no shel Avraham. So that everyone will testify that he is definitely Abraham's son. Minayin, how do we know this? Just as we read in the first pasuk of this week's Parashah, the first verse of this week's Parashah, these are the generations of Isaac, son of Abraham. If you've already told me that his name is Yitzchak, son of Abraham, do I really need to know that Abraham begot Yitzchak? So what's it actually teaching us? Avraham olidet Yitzchak, when it says that Abraham begot Isaac, it means this: Shekol haro'eh Avraham haya omer b'vada'ai she'Avraham olidet Yitzchak. Everyone who ever saw Abraham would immediately say, "Oh, Avraham begot Yitzchak." Why? Because they look so similar. From the fact that their facial appearances were, their countenances were almost identical. That's why it says Abraham holid et Yitzchak. Okay, so that's the first midrash I want to share with you. Now, this really isn't an example of the Torah uttering a fiction. Right? Remember, the beginning is great is peace, so great is peace that the Torah will tell a fiction rather than the truth in order to promote the virtue of peace. But it's certainly a continuation of the same theme, because it's hard to pronounce. Yitzchak's face, Isaac's face, was going to look a certain way, but God interceded to make him look another way. Yitzchak ended up looking like Abraham, even if that wasn't how he was supposed to look, right? So God acted so as to distort appearances, because this distortion would subdue the rumors and create peace, right? There's this notion already that some sort of distortion of appearances or a promotion of fiction can somehow benefit the agenda of peace. Before we look more closely at the words of this midrash, right, and just skim reading the midrash as we've done, it almost seems as if the midrash isn't denying the rumors, right? We've got these rumors. Who was the real father? Instead, the midrash only reports the deceptive means that God took in order to subdue the rumors. That's hardly reassuring, right? Apparently, if Yitzchak had been able to, mature in utero as he would naturally have matured, maybe he'd have come out looking like Pharaoh. Maybe he'd have come out looking like Avimelech, right? We should be worried that God even had to intercede. Now, perhaps the most famous scene in our Parsha, right, is the one I spoke of where Yaakov dons a costume of deer skin in order to disguise himself as his brother. This costume was placed upon Yaakov by Rivka, his mother, in order that she should achieve her goal. Right? So Yitzchak was blind. And if Yaakov could only feel like Esav to Yitzchak's touch, then Rivka hoped Yaakov might receive fraudulently Yitzchak's blessing. Now, it turns out that by the lights of our midrash, the midrash at the beginning of the Parsha, Yaakov wasn't the first member of his family to have a distorted appearance thrust upon him to achieve a goal, right? God himself had given Yitzchak a fake appearance from birth in order to subdue the damaging rumors surrounding his conception. Likewise, Yaakov wore a deceptive costume thrust upon him by his mother. But Yaakov, he only wore a deceptive costume once. Yitzchak's face, by contrast, had been a costume from even before he was born, right? He was constantly wearing, so to speak, an Abraham mask because he wasn't supposed to look exactly like Abraham, but he did because of this miracle that God thrust upon him. So our midrash, the midrash we just read from Tanakh, it wants us to confront the relationship between peace and truth, fiction, reality, between the ends you have, the goal you have, and the means that you use to achieve that goal. And my suggestion is, right, that this midrash about Yitzchak's face, tagged on to the very first verse of our parasha, right, Ele Toldot Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram Holidet Yitzchak, it actually opens up the very issues that will animate our Parsha's central scene. At the end of last week's midrash or session, I mentioned that sometimes a midrash feels like it's just pegged on to a verse. And perhaps that was true of the midrash we looked at last week about Abraham's age, or the signs of Abraham's age. But sometimes you feel like a midrash unlocks an entire parsha for you. And I want to suggest there's something more like that going on over here. Yes, it's just the first verse, but these themes of the conflict between peace and truth, fiction and reality, ends and means, they are some of the key themes of the entire parsha. So to zoom out a little bit, Yitzchak had wanted to bless Esav, his eldest son. Now, like in Chazalic tradition, and I suppose it's slightly later Rabbinic tradition, Yitzchak is associated with the attribute of justice. And just like justice, Yitzchak is described as being blind, at least as he gets older. And given the blindness of justice, it really doesn't matter who's more worthy, Yaakov or Esav. Blind justice dictates that the oldest son receives a birthright, right? Perhaps Yitzchak didn't know that Yaakov, in an earlier scene of this week's Parsha, had legally bought the birthright. But either way, so you could try to make the case that Yitzchak's preference for Esav has to do with the blindness of justice. And maybe that's true in part, but either way, it's clear that Yitzchak's preference for Esav runs deeper than just blind justice. It's written in this week's Parasha, I didn't put this on the handout, Genesis 25:28. Vaye Ehav Yitzchak et Esav ki tzayid b'fiv. V'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. Yitzchak loved Esav because he had a taste for game. That's one translation of ki tzayid b'fiv. And Rivka loved, favored Yaakov. So on a flat-footed literal translation, you've got this idea that Yitzchak favored Esav because he had food in his mouth. Okay. Accordingly, the Midrash suggests that Yitzchak favored Esav, and this is a Midrash that Rashi quotes. Yitzchak favored Esav only because Esav was skilled at deceitful use of language, using words as traps. Ki tzayid b'fiv, there was trapping in his mouth. So Esav was a skilled liar who was able to capture the affection of his father on false pretenses. So the real liar, if you want to find a liar in this week's Parashah, it was Esav, not Yaakov. Right? But even if we restrict our attention to the plain meaning of the verses, and we put all our midrashim to one side, it really does seem odd that Yitzchak should prefer Esav. Like, why does Esav's hunting, why does it make him more worthy than Yaakov, who's described as this kind of mild-mannered, perhaps even studious young man who's described as of pure heart, who's a tent dweller, he likes to stay indoors. One suggestion is this meat in his mouth is referring to meat in Yitzchak's mouth, and that Yitzchak had been bribed, just like Yaakov bribes Esav with the lentil stew to buy the birthright. Esav bribed his father with all of this yummy meat. And before you jump down my throat and say, how dare you accuse Yitzchak of being bribed, the Torah says in two places, in Sefer Shemot and in Sefer Devarim, that bribery is able to blind even the eyes of the righteous. So even righteous people can be blinded by bribery. Sometimes you don't even know you're being bribed. So that is one reading that has some traction. Or perhaps the attraction is that Esav and Yitzchak, they're both men of the field. They're lovers of the outdoors. The very first time that Rivka sees Yitzchak, remember in last week's Parashah, which we read yesterday, he's walking in the field. From the word lasuach, he went lasuach b'sadeh, which is a verb. From that verb, it seems that Yitzchak had gone outdoors at dusk in order to meditate or pray. It could literally mean to converse. Esav, by contrast, he went outdoors to hunt. So it strikes me that these are very different sorts of outdoorsy people, right? Yitzchak goes outdoors to kind of meditate in the grandeur of the landscape. Esav goes outdoors to hunt. So the suggestion, I'm clutching at straws. The text gives us very little to go on, right? So here's another contrast that you can find in the text. So you can try and find similarities between Yitzchak and Esav to explain the love, which, that was the outdoors suggestion. Or you could look for dissimilarities between Esav and Yaakov, and then try and see, what Yitzchak's preference may have been kind of addressing. So one contrast we have in the text is the text gives us very little to go on. One contrast we have in the text is that Yaakov is described as a smooth-skinned man, whereas Esav was covered in hair. Indeed, Esav was so hairy that Yaakov disguises himself using goat skin. Right? Esav's nation is later called Seir, right, which literally means goat. And his actual name, the name he was given by his parents, Esav, it means ready-made, because he came out like an adult, like covered in hair, like a bearded baby, Now we don't have much to go on. And since we're trying to get to the bottom of Yitzchak's preference for Esav, right, perhaps a question we should ask, like a research project, should be, okay, why might Yitzchak prefer the almost absurdly hairy son to the smooth-skinned man? Because we've got nothing else to go on. right? What might hair symbolize? So here I admit I'm now moving away from the pshat. I've been focusing very carefully on what the verses tell us about these individuals. And I'm going to move into the world of symbolism because it seems as if the hair must symbolize something, right? At least on one potential avenue for explaining Yitzchak's preference for Yaakov, for Esav. It's the hairiness. So we might want to jump into kind of rabbinic texts and look at what hairiness symbolizes. There's this strange midrash that's on the handout. It's from Bereshit Rabbah 4:4. Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Isi. Ha'amim she'ein ha'olam umlo'o machazikim kvod Elohuto. There are times when it seems like the entire universe and all that's in it can't, they're not sufficiently strong to hold on to the glory of God's divinity. But there are other times, there are times where God seems to be so immanently present that he talks to a person from, so to speak, between the hairs on his head. As it says in the book of Job, of Eov, God answered Job from amidst the whirlwind. But playing on the word sa'ara, if you change the samach for a sin, which makes the same sound, you get the word hair. Mibain sa'arot rosho. God addressed Job from between his hairs. That's a strange midrash if ever there was one. Think also of Shimshon, whose superhuman strength seems to be vested somehow in his head of hair, right? In Shimshon's youth, the word of God is described again in a rabbinic reading. This is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, Masechet Sota. It describes God's prophecy when in the book of Judges 13:25 describes God's prophecy as ringing in the ears of Shimshon. The rabbis imagine the ringing of the Holy Spirit emerging from the clanging sounds of his superhuman locks of hair jangling in the wind. Yes, it's a nice association there. Elana with Eliyahu and Elisha. We think of prophets as being hairy men, right? When they're men, there are female prophets, of course. And the rabbis go on with this notion that the prophecy is somehow jangling in the hair of Shimshon. God is speaking to Eov, from between his hairs. Yes, Jennifer.
Oh, hey, thanks so much. I'm just outside. I'm sorry I can't turn on my video. It just would be distracted. Hey, can you just review for 1/2 sec? What was the initial deception that Esav perpetrated there on his father, aside from the idea that he's manipulating him with the meat?
With that, good. So one reading is that he bribes him with meat, but Rashi's preferred reading is that Sayyid Bafiv means he traps his father with lies. And then the question is what lies? So
yes,
So Rashi gives some examples. They are all examples of a person presenting himself as being more interested in holiness than he really is. Right, so asking halakhic questions that he doesn't really care about. Right.
Oh,
so,
I see, and that's a midrash, though.
That's a midrash.
Okay, yeah.
No, and in fact, it's a particularly audacious midrash because really, if anyone's a liar in this week's Parashah, it's Yaakov and not Esav. So it's a really, audacious midrash.
Yes,
and it's partly because of the audacity of that midrash. I'm looking for something else, some other reason. For Yitzchak perhaps to have preferred Esav. Okay, but thanks, Jennifer. So,
thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. So these sources about Job and Samson, I gleaned from a great essay on this week's Parashah by Aviva Gottlieb Zonberg in her book on the Book of Genesis, at the beginning of Desire. She brings these tropes about hair together. And she concludes that hair in the rabbinic imagination somehow, quote, represents an ambiguous inner-outer status originating from within the body, but it's a vehicle of energies that have their source in God, end quote. God communicates with Job through his hair. His hair makes things ambiguous as to where he ends and where God begins. Instead of a smooth border, our hair gives us cloud-like edges. And Hashem, God, after all, he addresses us almost inevitably, almost invariably, from amidst a thick cloud. See, for example, Psalm 99. God lives in ambiguity. He lives in the cloud, like a cloud of hair. Another midrash, which Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg cites, describes God as, this is in Tanchuma on Parashat Tazria. The rabbis describe God as nourishing every follicle of our hair. This gives rise to the image of, and this is again a quote from Gottlieb Zornberg, the human being whose many hairs bristle with a vitality born of a complex hidden nature endowed by God. Yes, Yaakov was a mama's boy, and Esav similarly was his father, and that often happens with siblings. But what I'm suggesting, so now I've gone to some very fantastical, fabulous midrashim about hair, but I can bring this down to a more mundane level, and I think you could maybe see this in the verses. There is a vitality to Esav. There's a mystique, a rugged ambiguity. Godly powers seem to be moving inside of him, causing every follicle of hair to bristle with life. Yaakov, the mild-mannered, baby-faced tent dweller, just struck Yitzchak as a less attractive heir. Indeed, we're told that Yitzchak, even before the great deception where Yaakov dresses up as Esav, we're told that Yitzchak was distressed by Esav's taste in women. This occurs in Genesis 26. But here's my working hypothesis. Okay, and I would suggest that even though it's informed by midrashim, it's got as good a basis in the verses as any other description of, or any other account of Yaakov's preference for Esav. So Yitzchak's preference for Esav. And it goes like this. Yitzchak thought that a person with the passion and energy of Esav would be a better leader of the Jewish people than a timid, tent-dwelling recluse. If only that passion and energy that drives him to go hunting outside could just be harnessed and directed towards the good. So that's my working hypothesis. The thing is, you see, Yitzchak was wrong about Esav. And he was wrong about Yaakov too. It's true that the growth of hair has a symbolic resonance in the midrashic mind, right? A resonance which informs perhaps even the centrality of the beard in many rabbinic circles. But hair is not always cast in a positive light. Think again of Shimshon. Moreover, hair, it allows for dirt to take hold, for food to get stuck. Any dirt that attaches to a smooth-skinned fellow falls off with ease, but gets stuck in the tangles of the hairy man. And that's what leads us to the next midrash I want to share with you. It's again from Bereshit Rabbah. Rabbi Levi Amar Mashal lekavatz v'kareach. I'm going to give you an analogy, says Rabbi Levi, of a hairy man and a bald man that was standing on the threshing room floor. Right, shahayu omdim al sfat hagoren. Va'ala hamot b'kavatz v'nistabech b's'aro. All of the dross, the chaff, flew up from the threshing room floor into the beard of the hairy man, and he got stuck there. Allah hamotz b'kireach v'natanya doa rosho v'he'viro. The same dross, the same chaff blew up onto the smooth-skinned person. With just one brush of the hand, it all passed away. Kach Esav harasha So too, the wicked Esau, he gets soiled in sin all of the days of the year, and he's got no means of atonement. Aval Yaakov, Jacob also gets soiled in sin during the days of the year, but he has Yom Kippur. He has a means of atonement. It's a day of atonement. What's going on? I want to suggest, right? Esau's hair could have symbolized all sorts of things, but it's not actually a sign of godliness. It's a sign of his entanglement in the world of sin. Think of how Avshalom dies in the Bible. Avshalom is David's rebellious son, who dies as he gets entangled with his long locks of hair, get entangled in a tree from which he hangs and dies. Yaakov's smooth skin, by contrast, is not a sign of a lack of vitality. It is not a sign of his timidity. That's what it can sometimes symbolize, but not in Yaakov. In Yaakov, it was actually a sign of his ability to stay clean from the taint that sin leaves behind. And however much Judaism might venerate the beard, right, there are times when the Torah actually commands the complete destruction of all bodily hair. For example, during the inauguration of the Leviim in the book of Numbers, chapter 8, in the service about the rehabilitation of the lepers in Vayikra 14. Also the Nazir, who doesn't destroy all of his or her bodily hair, but at least the hair on their head. Sometimes, somehow, hair can be an obstacle. Right. So here's the question. If I'm right, okay, forget again all the midrashim and all the symbolism. Let's go to a simple literary reading of the book of Genesis. I'm suggesting Isaac prefers Esav for the position of leader because Esav seems to have a certain vitality, passion, and power that the timid, tent-dwelling Jacob doesn't seem to have. Now, Isaac is wrong. Jacob does have vitality, he does have courage, he does have audacity, he does have energy and passion. But the riddle now becomes, how can Jacob prove to his father that he isn't too timid to act, that he does have divine energy bubbling within, and that his hairlessness doesn't signify a lack of vitality? Now, Rivka believes in Jacob, Rebecca. Rivka can tell Yitzchak her opinion. She can tell him, trust me, darling. Yaakov's the right person to take the Jewish people forward, to receive the blessing of Abraham, to inherit the birthright. But the riddle becomes, what evidence can she offer? So here comes my reading of this most dramatic scene. When Yaakov dresses up as Esav and has the gall to deceive his father in order to win what he believes to be his right, he finally demonstrates to his father that he isn't empty on the inside and that he does have the energy and passion that it takes to lead the people. It was, if my reading's correct, and we're going to check it out in the verses, it was a case of deception that revealed an underlying truth. Yitzchak came to understand through Yaakov's deception that it really is possible to combine the purity of Yaakov with the gall of Esav, to have, in the words that Yitzchak finally uses, the hands of an Esau and the voice of a Jacob. But let's have a look at the verses inside. And here we can turn back to our handout. These verses are all from chapter 27, right? So Yitzchak, what about this notion? Actually, Yaakov's actions in this Parashah are not initiated by him. They're actually all thought up by Rivka. That's right. What I think is going on is that Rivka knows something about Yaakov that neither Yaakov nor Yitzchak knows. Rivka knows that Yaakov has the necessary gall, the necessary audacity, the necessary internal energy to lead a people. Rivka knows that. But Yaakov doesn't know about himself, and Yitzchak certainly doesn't know it about Yaakov. So by going through this rigmarole, dressing up as his brother and having the audacity to, attempt to lie to his father, Rivka demonstrates to two people at once a truth about Yaakov. But let's have a look at the verses. Okay. Yitzchak said to Yaakov, this is verse 21. Yitzchak said to Yaakov, come closer that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son, Esau or not. Right, so in that verse, it seems that Yitzchak, despite his failing eyesight, he's suspicious right from the get-go, right? Then we go to the next verse. So Yaakov drew close to his father Yitzchak, who felt him and wondered. The voice is a voice of Yaakov, yet the hands are the hands of Esav. Right? In this verse, verse 22, it really already seems like the game's up. Straight away, like Yitzchak's not stupid. He may be blind. He's not stupid, right? The hands are the hands of Esav, but Yitzchak knows. He knows the voice. He recognizes it straight away. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. Yaakov's come dressed up. But then again, right? If the costume was really such a failure, why does Yitzchak continue to fail to recognize Yaakov in the next verse? Right, in the next verse he says he didn't recognize him because his hands were hairy, like those of his brother Esav, and so he blessed him. Right? Why does Yitzchak fail to recognize Yaakov in verse 23, such that he has to ask him in verse 24? Are you really my son Esav? Right, and then Yaakov says, I am. This is how I suggest we read the story. When Yaakov draws close to his father in verse 22, his father feels the costume and figures out exactly what's going on. But what shocks him is the notion that the mild-mannered Yaakov would have the guts to try something like this. He's shocked to hear that someone with the voice of a Yaakov, the inner purity of a mild-mannered tent dweller, could manage to have the hands of an Esav. And that's why we're told, I think, in verse 23, even though the game's up, that Yitzchak didn't recognize Yaakov. The point isn't that Yitzchak mistakes his identity. He knows that it is Yaakov, right? He can feel that his costume hands are like those of his brother Esav. The hint here is that Yitzchak, even when he's not recognizing Yaakov, he knows that Esav is the brother of the person in the costume. In other words, Yitzchak knows that it's Yaakov, but he doesn't recognize this side of Yaakov. Look at that verse again. He didn't recognize him because his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esav. Okay. He knows who's standing before him, but he just doesn't recognize this side of Yaakov. And it's as if to test his resolve in verse 24, to see if he'd crack under the pressure. He asks again, are you really my son, Esav? And Yaakov doesn't give in. He says, yep, I am. And that's when Yitzchak blesses Yaakov. Now, don't be deceived in this Parashah of deception. He doesn't give him the blessing of Abraham. Not there and then. That's to say, he doesn't explicitly bestow upon Yaakov the status of heir to the Abrahamic covenant. We know this because in the next chapter, he explicitly invites his son Yaakov back, and he gives him explicitly the blessing of Abraham. Right now, he simply blesses his son as any father might. It's not giving him he's not making him heir, not yet. He is, so to speak, just biding his time. But then we see Esav enters, and Esav has come too late. Yitzchak, we're told, this is in a verse that I didn't quote in the handout, he's shaken to the core and seized with a violent trembling. Now, if my reading of the text until now has been correct, then Yitzchak shouldn't have been surprised when Esav comes in and, upset. And yet, I think it was really only then, when Yitzchak had witnessed his crestfallen elder son picked to the post by his upstart younger brother, that it finally occurred to Yitzchak. Not only was there more to Yaakov than he had realized until now, but perhaps there was less to Esav, right? And it's only then that Yitzchak calls Yaakov back of his own accord, without any deception, to offer him voluntarily the blessing of Abraham. Why? Because Rivka's ruse and Yaakov's disguise, which Yitzchak had seen right through, had revealed a truth about Yaakov to Yitzchak. And perhaps it had revealed this truth to Yaakov himself, a truth that Yitzchak and perhaps Yaakov had never appreciated until now. And it's only after this deception, this kind of failed deception on my reading, and after witnessing the crestfallen Esav, that Yitzchak, of his own volition, with completely informed volition, it's only then that he, so to speak, crowns Yaakov as the rightful heir. So if we return to our first midrash, the one that's right at the beginning of the Parashah, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with Yaakov and Esav, and look more closely at its words, it's clear that it does actually repudiate the pernicious rumors about Yitzchak's conception. Because if you look closely at the words, God commands the angel, in the words of the Midrash, to fashion this embryo in the exact likeness of his father, right? So of course, Abraham was Yitzchak's father, right? Otherwise it would be a mekach ta'ut, very nice, right? His father. But it was only a distortion of Yitzchak's appearance that would allow the world to come to know the truth, right? The brothers in our first midrash, they told a lie to Yosef about Yaakov, but that lie, it expressed an underlying truth about Yaakov's desire for peace between his children. Likewise, and of course, Yaakov was the brother who should receive the inheritance of Abraham. Rivka was right all along, but only a distortion of appearances would allow Yitzchak to see the truth. And here we get close to the mystical notion that's developed a bit later than Midrash, really, of a levush, a garment. Because a garment hides the body, and yet at the same time, the way that you clothe yourself also reveals a lot about who you are, right? Clothing allows you to appear in public. You wouldn't appear in public at all if you didn't have some clothes to hide those parts of your body that, are private. So garments conceal and they reveal in the ways that they conceal. And according to the Kabbalah, this entire world is a levush, right? We can't see God directly and live, says God to Moshe in Sefer Shemot. So he hides himself. He wears the world as a costume, and we see his outline in the cloak behind which he hides. Now, I've got a few minutes, and I just want to relate this reading of mine to perhaps some more classical and philosophical readings. You see, the rabbinic consensus, it doesn't demand truthfulness at all times. There are specific circumstances in which Jewish law permits, sometimes even demands, deception and even outright lies, right? There is a sin of deception, right? And it's known as genevat dat, right? But it doesn't always apply. Genevat dat literally means the stealing of knowledge. According to the canons of Jewish law, a person is allowed to deceive or even sometimes to lie for various reasons, One of them is to preserve a state of peace, which is part of what our initial Midrash was pointing to. But that exception is only operative if the objective can't be achieved without deception or lying, and if the discord prevented or ended by the lie or the deception isn't assessed to be such that it will re-emerge in exacerbated form if and when the lie or the deception is exposed. And there are other exceptions too. You know, deception, even sometimes outright lying, are allowed to protect modesty, humility, privacy, to prevent exploitation. And it should go without saying to save a life, right? But the problem for most Parashanim as they look at this story is how was it that Yaakov isn't guilty of Genevat Dat? Okay. You also have the Kantian tradition outside of Jewish law, where Kant, he thinks it's unethical to lie, and there's no exception, right? He argued that to assert a falsehood is to violate what he called a categorical imperative. Even to save a life, a person can, according to Kant, at most assert a deceptive truth, but never a falsehood, right? And it's clear that for Kant, the obligation isn't to promote true beliefs in others or to prevent other people from forming false beliefs. The obligation is merely never to let a falsehood pass your lips, okay? As Alistair, there's a philosopher called Alistair McIntyre, the way that he portrays Kant, he says, look, it's my duty to assert only what's true. And if you take mistaken inferences from what I say, then that's your fault. It's not my responsibility. You know, in a sense, it's kind of a selfish ethic of Kant. It puts truth-telling on a pedestal, since the obligation not to lie, it knows of no exceptions. But there's no deep concern that people will actually understand your assertions, right? You have no responsibility to shepherd people to a correct interpretation of your words, as long as your words weren't formally false. Think of Bill Clinton when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." He thought he was telling the truth, even though he must have known he was deceiving people, right? So there are various readings of this week's Parashah that try to save Yaakov of Genevat Dat, or they even try to save him by Kantian lines, which is really quite remarkable. Remember, Yaakov says to Yitzchak the words, "I am Esav, your firstborn son," right? Which seems like an outright lie. But despite these appearances, like I said, there have been attempts to read the story in ways that vindicate Yaakov, both from Genevat Dat and from the wrong of telling lies, even by Kantian lies, right? So you've got Rashi. He finds this really ingenious way of passing Yaakov's words such that technically he didn't lie. So instead of answering his father's question with the words, "I am Esav, your firstborn," the Hebrew words, right, Anochi Esav ha-b'chorecha, the words in question, they allow at a tremendous stretch for the following translation. I am me, Esav is your firstborn. If such a reading can be sustained, then Yaakov's words were deceptive. He didn't lie. If Yitzchak drew a false inference from those words, then that would be Yitzchak's responsibility, not Yaakov's. So if Rashi's right, Kant would be proud. Moreover, and this I get from the Torah Shalema of Rabbi Menachem Kasher, since Yaakov had rightfully purchased the birthright from Esav in chapter 25, Yaakov stood at risk of being exploited by Esav's illicitly receiving the blessing that Esav had rightfully sold to Yaakov. Arguably, this would constitute one of those rare instances in which the prohibition of Genevat Dat is suspended, namely to save someone from exploitation. If people are interested in this, all of these sorts of vindications of Yaakov have recently been developed very skillfully by Shira Weiss in a chapter on Yaakov and Esav in a book that I edited called Jewish philosophy in an analytic age, published by Oxford University Press. But it's my contention that all of these attempts, however ingenious Shira's paper is, all of these attempts to reconcile the story with Kantian ethics, and even with the notion of Genevat Dat, they're missing the point. The point of the story is that Kantian ethics, first of all, they're wrong about the duty to tell the truth. And secondly, the sin of Genevat Dat, it can't apply to a lie that's told in the service of truth. And that's what these are. Lies told not just in the service of peace, but lies told in the service of truth. Yitzchak's face didn't look the way it was supposed to. It was a deceptive appearance, but it helped to communicate a truth. The truth being that Yitzchak really was Abraham's son. Yaakov dressed up as Esav, that was deceitful, but the lie was designed to advance a truth, namely that Yitzchak really had certain character traits, that Yaakov really had certain character traits that Yitzchak didn't recognize he had. Perhaps even Yaakov didn't know he had them until he did this. What's so interesting about Yaakov's lie, and what other readings miss, and I think our first midrash is pointing us to, is the idea that some falsehoods are aimed at communicating truth, right? And that isn't a case that's truly familiar to Jewish law. It's not a case where truth is superseded by the value of peace, or truth is superseded by the value of humility, by the value of modesty or privacy. No, on the contrary, the value of truth here isn't superseded at all. That's why you can't call it Genevat Dat, which literally means the stealing of knowledge. Instead, this is a lie told specifically for the purposes of communicating truth and extending Yitzchak's knowledge. Right? So, if this reading's right, then it carries an implicit criticism of Kantian ethics. Kant is right to value truth-telling, but he bakes this value into his ethical system in the wrong place. He treats truth-telling as a constraint on assertion, meaning you should never assert anything that isn't true. But that's wrong. The promotion of truth is better treated not as a constraint on assertion, but as a goal. Like Kant's acts of assertion are constrained by a formal requirement not to say something false. He seems completely unmoved by the altruistic goal of spreading true belief. But spreading true belief, that should be the goal of assertion. A goal which we sometimes suspend in deference to other values, peace, modesty, privacy. And this goal of spreading spreading truth, spreading knowledge, this goal shouldn't be constrained by the obligation never to tell a lie, because sometimes, as we've seen in the case of Yaakov, a lie can be the only way ultimately to help somebody to see the truth. Yitzchak would never have believed that Yaakov had the gall that Yitzchak was looking for in a leader until he saw him attempt this ludicrous feat of deception. It was a lie in the service of truth. Now, just to finish off, if you really read this story closely, the way that I'm doing, in the way that I'm doing, along the interpretative path that I'm using, the notion that one can lie in the name of spreading true belief, it comes with certain provisos attached that you can kind of milk out of the story. First, the person to whom the lie was told should also be the very same person who benefits from the illumination, right? Once the lie has been revealed for what it was, right? That's to say the person lied to and the person who benefits from the subsequent illumination that the lie provides, they have to be the same person. And they were both, in this case, Yitzchak. A second proviso you might be able to milk from the text. notice that the lie was about Yaakov's identity, and it was also told in order to communicate a truth about Yaakov's identity, namely that Yaakov wasn't the damp squib that Yitzchak had taken him to be, right? So accordingly, the second restriction should be something like, even when lying in order to promote true belief, the lie must be about the same topic as the resultant true belief. And there's a third proviso which kind of follows from the first two, and it certainly is clear in the biblical story. Once the true belief is revealed, nothing about the lie will still be believed, right? In the end, it's revealed to Yitzchak exactly what went on. And so long as these three provisos are met, I suggest, the biblical story is telling us that it is sometimes acceptable, perhaps even the right thing to do, to lie in the service of truth, which is perhaps a new category. It's not suspending the value of truth in the face of other values, which is something that's familiar to other Jewish sources. It's suspending telling the truth right now in deference the value of some greater or more important truth. It certainly goes against Kant. The ultimate goal of I'll take questions. The last sentence I have really is that we learn from Yaakov, and this is something we're going to come back to week in, week out for a little while. Yaakov is the Kabbalistic symbol of truth. If Yitzchak is supposed to be din, Yaakov is supposed to be truth. And that's sometimes very surprising because all we see is Yaakov lying all the time, right? Oh, I hope you're not losing me.
I'm not sure if it's just my computer or if you were just breaking up a little bit. Can anyone else weigh in on whether they were having that?
I hear you fine.
Good.
Okay.
So anyway, the final point was that it's somewhat surprising the rabbis actually go out of their way. They treat Yaakov as a symbol for truth. When our first interactions with him in the Torah are all to do with these lies that we're looking at. But we learn from Yaakov that the crooked road to peace will often reveal the deeper truth, so long as we don't, so to speak, allow its crookedness to leave a remnant tangled in our hair. All right, I'll take some questions. We've got a couple of minutes. Yes, Jennifer.
Thank you. I just learned so much from you.
Thank you so
every
much.
time. I wondered, when you had said that that Abraham was that Yaakov seemed like a tent dweller, all of that. I immediately thought of Isaac's relationship with his father Abraham, and how that kind of devotion to what I want to say is that Yitzhak could have been maybe scarred by the relationship with a person like that, so he'd be much more willing to bond with Esav.
No, I fully agree with that. I think that's a lovely observation. There may have been something that looked like a kind of spiritual piety that Yitzchak knew only too well could lead to negative places, as we see.
Yes. Yeah. And then one last thing, I don't want to monopolize the end time. Last thing, that perhaps when he realized that he'd sacrificed, when he trembles when Esav comes in, that he'd sacrificed his birthright to his brother, that he had sort of in a way done what his father had tried to do, which was to sacrifice him.
A son. Yes, yeah. That's a very, very interesting point, Jennifer.
Anyway,
very profound.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to do here in this session, I'll just round up with this really, is one thing at the level of Pshat and one thing at the level of Midrash. At the level of Pshat, it was the following. I'm reading this deception scene, And if on the way I understand the verses, Isaac works it out straight away. This is a bad disguise, and he knows that it's Jacob. What he doesn't recognize is this side of Jacob. And that leads to an entirely different reading of the story, in which Isaac was looking for certain character traits that he didn't see in Jacob, and that Rivka helps Jacob and Yitzchak to see that Jacob really does have these character traits, and they're led to see this by the somewhat ludicrous attempt for Jacob to dress up as Esav. That's at the level of Pshat. At the level of Midrash, I then go back to this opening Midrash of this week's Parashah that says that the entire life of Isaac was lived behind a false mask, a fake appearance that actually communicated a deep truth, that Yitzchak really was the son of Abraham, despite all the rumors to the contrary. And then you see that this somewhat fanciful Midrash right at the beginning of the Parashah is introducing us to one of the central notions that the story of Jacob's somewhat ludicrous deception of Isaac is designed to introduce to us, the notion being a lie told or a deception practiced for the service of truth, or in the service of truth. So that's the conclusion. All right, everybody, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. Have a great week. Shavuot tov.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lebens.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us. So lovely to learn with you. We at Drisha will be observing American Thanksgiving this Thursday, but on the rest of the week, we've got tons and tons of fantastic classes coming up, including some new classes, I believe, that are starting. So please check that out at 5783.drisha.org. And we're looking forward to learning with you again. Thank you, Dr. Lebens.